I'm your host, Anthony Monteith, and I'm here today with Egwin Ertl, who is a friend and colleague. We've been working together for 4 or 5 years. We've met twice in Canada, once in London, and I'm joining him today to have a conversation around consciousness, movement, and general hanging out of trees and swinging upside down, which is what he does best. So Egwin, thanks for joining me. If you could give the viewers a little brief, because I know you like to give the detail, but could you give me a little brief overview of your big, massive journey that you've had in your life to get to where you are?
Sure. Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for having me on, Anthony. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. And I really appreciate the conversations that we tend to have. And happy for every second we get. And since there is always so many awesome nuggets in there, it's even better now to be able to share this via this podcast with a broad audience. I really appreciate that. It's awesome.
Awesome.
All right. So for everyone who doesn't know me so far, again, my name is Egwin. I'm now the founder of Beyond Systems. And just to give you a rough roundup of where I come from first, my journey with regards to conscious movement and personal development started very, very early, considering that I'm originally from Austria. So very early means that I started with Shaolin Kung Fu and Qigong at the age of 8, which is quite uncommon in our culture. And so now I'm 31 years into training Qigong. I've practiced about 25 years of hygiene and Bagua and martial arts stuff. But all of those are just parts of the background. So I also had my feet in contemporary dance, in many different healing modalities, hands-on modalities, traditional Chinese medicine. I studied Western medicine for some time before I chose to switch my attention 100% to teaching. And I also incorporated a lot of other movement modalities, like, for example, Alexander technique and yoga, aerial acrobatics, rock climbing, you name it. And I know for some people this might sound a little bit overwhelming with regard to the many different ins and outs, but to me it really was not much else than necessity, because I started very early to realize there are certain things in my life that I didn't want to happen the way they did, both psychologically, spiritually, as well as physically. I was always looking to just improve myself, not for the sake of winning any sort of competition or anything like that, but for the sake of just really using the potential I have to be healthy, to heal myself, to support others. And this journey was definitely a rocky one in parts. I think every single one who had some issues at a point probably made the experience that it's not always a smooth ride to find the modality that actually helps you right away. And that's what happened for me too. So that also describes the ride through different modalities. I was always on the lookout. Okay, what is the next thing that can help me to overcome a certain issue and to refine whatever I know even further. The one constant always has been Qigong, and to name it even more, neutral movement in general. So that connection of movement, consciousness, emotions, mind, energy, that was always the foundation of how I walked this path. Yeah, and back when I was in my teens, I also got quite an interesting, from a Western medical point of view, not so ideal diagnosis for my spine. Considering where I am right now, nothing of what the doctors back then prophesized actually happened. On the contrary, I'm more mobile and also stronger than I've been back then. I'm absolutely pain-free. There is no issues there at all. There are certain very extreme movements where I know I have to be careful with. But anyway, this is all part of that journey as well. And even back then, when my doctor said, well, um, best to stop any sort of training, best to stop any kind of ambition regarding movement or sports, I always have been a little bit of a rebellious one, and I basically told him to fuck off. I'm not sure if we are allowed to say that on here, but yeah.
Yeah, we
Anyway,
are. It's my podcast. We can say what we like.
okay, awesome, Anthony. So basically, yeah, and I did do physical therapy back then as well, but even that ended totally different. Meaning, the physical therapist looked at me, looked at the diagnosis, and basically said, well, that's medically speaking almost impossible because you should crawl in here on all fours and in pain. And I wasn't. And then he basically said, look, I can't help you with anything because you don't have any symptoms. The only thing I can do is teach you some of the things I know and help you improve a little bit. And turned out that he was actually the former physiotherapist of the ski jumping team of Finland. Wow. So even back then, he had some tricks up his sleeve that weren't exactly industry standard for a regular person, which was great for me because it introduced me very soon to understanding how much more potential there is beyond of what is available for the mainstream, or the mainstream even thinks or talks about. And that was just one of many stepping stones that eventually led me to realizing more and more and more that the solutions, if one wants to call it solutions, for whether that's issues or actually also just self-improvement, they can't be narrowed down to one singular specific system. Every single person is slightly different. So every single one of us would need a individualized system already. And then on top of that, depending on which steps you take, a healing journey or also a self-improvement journey requires different input to actually then bring forth the next stage of healing, the next stage of integrating a knowledge and actually making whatever you learned or whatever you got better at, integrating that into your real life. And so that is why I jumped between so many different systems. And when I say jumped, then this doesn't mean that I jumped into a system, meaning tipping my toe in, and 2 hours later I went back out again and I did the next one. But whatever I did, I really did quite intensively. So just to give you a rough example, in my prime time, quote unquote, I spent around 35 to 40 hours of training Qigong martial arts and Tai Chi every single week for the better part of 6 years out of the more than 30 years that I've been doing all those things. Yeah. And so basically what a normal person would do in a regular 9-to-5 job, I did as well, but in training and self-improvement. Yeah. And since I made it my job, I was able to actually dedicate that time and also the necessary money to do that, which was awesome because it helped me to get to a point where eventually I was able to distill the necessary information out of that to be able to support other people who cannot spend the same amount of time running around and just working on themselves, but who need applicable tools in their real life. Now, is there still a difference? Yes, of course there is still a difference. But bottom line being, I definitely strongly believe that it's not necessary to become a monk or to really spend the better part of your waking hours purely on self-improvement and basically lose sight of living. in order to progress to a point where you really feel solid and stable and happy and healthy in your life. And the
Yeah,
reason why I went so far is, like I said, purely it is definitely my passion, it is my interest, and that's always been in the forefront. And then specifically also the sharing part with
yeah.
others, and that is,
Well,
I think, also what resonates so well between Anthony and I, because like Anthony has a similar long journey in his past, as far
yeah,
as I know, and
the things that come out for me when you're talking is like you really went into everything. Like you said, right, I'm gonna do Xingyi Bagua, and I'm gonna go to the best people that I can find, and then I'm gonna go and play with a sword, and I'm gonna go and train to the best level that I can do within whatever restrictions I'm being faced with. For me, I kind of felt that you, when I talked to you, you were searching, and then you'd reached where you think you needed to be, and then that was a platform to jump, not so much diving, but to literally leap onto the next platform. Whereas for me, I was kind of going along, and then I'd have these flashpoints where the rug would be pulled from underneath me, and so then I'd be like, oh, I have to reevaluate. So the lessons for me have been reevaluating my beliefs, and uh, I always like, whenever I hang around with you, I always feel like I'm hanging around with an alien. I never feel like it's a human being I'm talking to. It's this like funky alien that can do weird stuff. And but it's kind of cool because, you know, as you said, you had at a young age, you had that awareness, that self-awareness to know my path is not going to be what everybody else around me. You know, you weren't subject to your environment, and I think where our similarity is the same thing. Like, you know, I had a working class father who was a painter and decorator and worked in the aircraft industry, and had a mother who never really had a career. She just drifted from job to job, but was always really good at what she did. And so I see where the hard work comes from my father, working long hours. I can do that. And then I see how the talent comes from my mom, you know, being able to be good at whatever I set my hands to, generally speaking, not everything, obviously. But yeah, for me, it's a series of kind of big events that shocked me into now discovering Chinese medicine, or now discovering Qigong, or whatever it is. You introduced me to human design. That's been a revelation for me because it's answered a lot of questions about my past. And I'm actually delving deeper into the more modern versions of that now that have arisen. So definitely you've helped me with my consciousness awareness, and you sort of removing me from that idea of always looking to the East, you know, always looking to Asia for the answers. It's more than that, because there are other hermetical concepts that have been around that have a similar singularity. So those kinds of things have been really helpful to me. Also, what's been great for me is I have clients who, another thing that I got from our conversations and from hanging out with you and doing work with you is this concept of which I think is fantastic, is stop being the therapist, you know, be the guide, you know, lead people to their own truth, in movement or consciousness, or even just injury prevention. And often when I get, you know, those clients that just is like a vampire and will try to pull every ounce of chi from your body, I say, go to this video of my buddy Egwin, and look how he's opening his chest, or look at how he treats his knees when he's walking. Watch the video and go and work with that, because it takes a lot of pressure off you as a therapist if you can guide your patients. And it's something that I'm you know, I'm approaching 50, and it's something I'm only learning now. I mean, I always did it, but it wasn't a conscious effort to do it. I wasn't making that conscious decision. I was kind of like just throwing little pearls here and there. And now I'm like, okay, if you come to me for treatment, I want you to work on yourself. And that's like the standard now with everyone. As you see, I'm on the floor. So I'm starting to learn about being more on the floor, sitting on the floor. I started laughing because I've got these really expensive couches behind me, and I'm purposely sitting on the floor. I've learned to squat again. I couldn't, the primal squat that you showed me about 2-3 years ago. I couldn't do that, and now I can. So I've been practicing that. I can hold it for quite a few minutes. I've been barefoot running. So I've been doing stuff that is not part of my qigong. It was never part of my qigong training, but it is qigong now. That makes sense. And I think
Absolutely.
that's what I kind of get from you, is it doesn't matter what I do, it's all the same thing. It's all comes with that same intent. Put a label on
Yeah.
it if you want, if it makes you feel comfortable. And so that's the overarching theme I get from you, is you'll allow people to put labels on it, but really it doesn't matter. It should all be coming from that center-led movement, from that awareness, as you call it. And I don't mean awareness as in, oh, the sky is blue and the floor is brown. It's an awareness that extends far beyond, visual or emotional interpretations. It's a complete embodiment of what, so bringing that consciousness completely as an integrated unit of space-time movement, and I think then that removes a lot of stress from people's lives once they get that idea that this, what we would have known when we were training as the monkey mind, and my teacher would say, if you've got a monkey mind, feed it a banana. And they say, what's the banana? What's the breath? It's the beginning part. So yeah, I've been watching your videos. I know you've got a good following and some loyal people that love what you do. I met a couple of them in Canada, and I can see that they really enjoy the interpretation. And so can you tell the viewers or the listeners, like, what was that fundamental leap in letting go and saying, right, beyond systems, you have a few different approaches. You have your beyond systems, and then scope of life, which was your channel, I believe. And you've also taught people that are climbers, that are, dancers, acrobats, people using silks, yoga people. It doesn't really matter who comes to you. There's always something that you can offer them. One of the biggest breakthroughs, I'd say, is when we did the fly high yoga, and you had me upside down, and there was a stretch, and it was almost like trauma release. I don't know if you remember this, but we had those straps going through the groin, and we were in that sort of butterfly position. And I felt really strange. I was like, God, I feel a little bit like I'm going to cry here. I feel overwhelmed. And then I was like, what is going on? And then when I come off you kind of flipped me back over, and you were saying, oh yeah, by the way, just to let you know, you can have like a traumatic, you can release some trauma in the body. And I was like, you Jesus Christ, Egwin, you could have told me before I got. So it's like amazing how some body positions can do that. I mean, it's more than just the position. It's the upside down, and you're in that womb sort of position. So there's obviously a lot to it. But so how did you suddenly was it like suddenly this light went on and you said, okay, this is the way I feel comfortable working now? Or was it just, you just kind of was it just kind of just a conscious decision to say, okay, this is really what I'm doing? Like, was there a pivotal moment for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there was really this one specific crack moment. What I do know is I was never one for dogmatic approaches. No matter if Qigong, if martial arts, and in martial arts, especially in traditional martial arts, I mean, you notice it is not so common to even be allowed to watch beyond your own dojo. Nowadays, this becomes better and better, but back in the day when we did those things, sometimes your teacher would just go crazy on you and literally threaten you, either psychologically or physically, if you went to any other school or stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true.
And this is just stuff that I was never comfortable with, in the sense of I never bowed to those rules and regulations, because I said, well, yeah, whatever modality I come across, it can only teach me so far. It can only teach me so much. There are many, many different other things out there that this specific approach just cannot nurture in me, just cannot bring those things to light. And then eventually I realized, while teaching, that even when I teach, I always start to weave different things together in the way I explain stuff, whether that's bridging Chinese medicine with modern research, or bringing in components from osteopathy or craniosacral therapy in Qigong or in yoga, stuff like that. So it was always a cross-pollination between different modalities. And then back in 2015, I was at the tipping point of a massive personal development step, and I realized I can't do that in the surroundings I'm at. And I moved out of Austria to Bali for a long time. For the longest time I've been away from Austria at that point, which was about 8 months, and until I felt the need to go back home, quote unquote, or back to Europe, let's call it that. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because before I left Austria, I realized that I wasn't happy anymore with where I was. I didn't want to teach Tai Chi anymore. I didn't want to teach martial arts anymore. It just didn't resonate anymore. And so I decided to find out what it truly is that I do as compared to many other people. And it always comes back down to the same thing, which is trying to teach fundamental principles, things that help you understand how the body, mind, consciousness, and so on work, that can then be integrated in absolutely everything that someone is doing. And this revelation started around 2015. This is where I started my YouTube channel, which back then was called Scope of Life. Before that, I had two different projects running, one burnout prevention project for corporations, for huge companies, where I worked with literally with Siemens and with the government and stuff like that, and helped through burnout prevention in different departments to sort of work on that corporate health side of things.
Yes.
That was one project. The other project was more the martial arts and the Qigong side. Scope of Life was the first one where I started to bring more of the different things together under one name. And then eventually, Beyond Systems, I think if it wasn't for that marketing training that we both did, where we met actually for the first time, I probably still wouldn't have a name for this whole thing. Yeah. Because I'm honestly not even sure if I'm really comfortable with naming it at all. But I felt like Beyond Systems is pretty much the closest thing that I can use to describe it.
Yeah.
And
it's just a brand, really, isn't it? It's not. It doesn't define what
exactly.
you do.
It's more the brand. And a friend of mine, actually, a couple of months ago, he summed it up in that way. He said, well, so basically what you're doing is you're teaching people their own language. You're teaching people to, give me 1 second here. So you're basically teaching people how to speak body, mind, emotion, consciousness, energy, like how those things communicate with each other. And that is actually a very, very spot on description of what I do nowadays and how I work. And you mentioned all those different modalities. And for me, it is really something I always use this picture. I always say different modalities, I see them as icebergs floating in the ocean. And every single iceberg resembles basically the techniques you see at the surface, and then obviously a huge amount of knowledge and functioning principles that make this whole thing float. Now, a typical multidisciplinary approach would be to be on the surface, connecting the tips of those icebergs with each other and pulling sometimes a little bit of this, sometimes a little bit of that modality. What I try to do with Beyond Systems has nothing to do with that. What I try to do with Beyond Systems is teach people how, quote unquote, the water works, so that they can literally distill an iceberg, aka the system they need at a certain given time to solve their issue whenever they need it, because they know how it works to create something for themselves, for their benefit. So that is another way to describe Beyond Systems. Mm-hmm. For me, it's really giving the education that most people do not get nowadays when they go into a 200-hour yoga teacher training or into a Feldenkrais training or stuff like that, or a meditation training for that matter. Really going down to the most fundamental puzzle pieces possible. That is my passion nowadays. And I always love it when things start to come together. Those are some of the most heartfelt and honest laughs I have in my life. Now, the last really big one I remember, I don't know if you're aware of this, if we've spoken since then, but last year in summer, I think it was August or something like that, I stumbled across new research regarding an ASR, so acute stress response. And obviously in Chinese medicine, the whole stress response system has a lot to do with kidneys, with the adrenals, with the water element. Another fun thing is also that in the water element, I'm just saying this for our viewers, you know, of course, the water element has some other links in the body, like for example, the legs, the bones, the marrow as well. And so one could say, well, stupid Chinese medicine, because I mean, what does an organ like the bladder or the adrenals or the kidneys have to do with the bones? Like there is literally no cross-link that makes any sense. Now I stumbled across a paper last year in summer, scientific peer-reviewed paper, where they were talking about the ASR, the acute stress response, and they said, well, turned out that we got it completely wrong all along. Mm-hmm. So even if you chemically take the ability of the adrenal glands to contribute any sort of adrenaline to a stress response, the stress response in the body still goes forward with almost all of its identifiable medical parameters, from the centralization to like shutting down certain organ systems to changing the insulin axis and stuff like that. All of that still happens. Yeah. And they realized that actually the role of the adrenals in the acute stress response was secondary action. The primary action was where glutamate started to release osteocalcin in the bones. And that osteocalcin then links out into the muscles, and then in the next stage activates the adrenals. So actually the acute stress response is factually something that is chemically driven, but through the bones and then into the body. And when I read that, I was like, I literally was laughing out for 5 minutes, because it was one of those amazing things where you realize, wow, okay, modern science just caught up with something that was described thousands of years ago in Chinese medicine, where most definitely those refined biochemical detection methods were not available, but through consciousness, through observation, it is still possible to come to the same conclusions. And so, speaking about pseudoscience in those regards, the more of such links that then come out towards, for example, those real hardcore medical peer-reviewed studies that that pop up nowadays, the more those links pop up, the more terminology like pseudoscience, when talking about an ancient, old, and empirically proven method of healing, for example, the more such a terminology becomes obsolete and actually very stupid, because it shows that it has nothing to do with pseudo. It is just something that you have not understood yet,
Yep.
but where if you use other methods and other way of research, whether that's accepted in the current world or not doesn't matter, but when you look at it in a different way, then suddenly you can pull on the very same informational threads and understand the very same thing. And in the end, this is all that matters. In the end, the most important thing for those traditional modalities is, does it work, yes or no? And the actual chemical reactions that are going on, they are not, it's not necessary to understand them in depth to use the old system to the fullest of its potential. When you want to nowadays add on medications and stuff like that, that now can regulate an acute stress response in an even more refined way, okay, fair enough, but that's developing a new method of approach that doesn't invalidate the traditional one. And I absolutely love it when bits and pieces of information from all different kinds of angles suddenly flow together and point to the very same functional principles.
I think my understanding of it is that, you know, as a human beings, fundamentally our intelligence and our consciousness has remained fairly much the same for, say, the last 40,000 years. It's just our tools have changed, you know, and the way we use the tools have changed. We've created new tools, so we're looking at everything through a different lens. Whereas I think prior, because we don't know what tools we had back then, maybe our tools were more internal than all these external representations now. You know, my teacher before he passed away said, you know, mobile phones are an external representation of skills that actually we can do internally. We can communicate telepathically. It's well known. People built high towers, you know, like we have them here in Ireland, where they go up 100 feet and people would sit in those towers and meditate, and it was a way of transmitting information. It's just, you know, that now sounds a little bit woo-woo because there's no science to back that up, right? Yet we've monkeys living on the North Island in Japan who are now going into the Stone Age, because monkeys on the South Island have learned to pick up a stick or a stone and use it as a weapon. And the monkeys on the North Island have never met them, yet somehow now copying that behavior, you know, and it's this. So I think we're still very behind the understanding of this current human design. What stood out for me also, that it's interesting you talk about that, because I think it was 2 to 3 years ago, they announced in like New Scientist, the interstitium, the 80th organ of the body. They only just discovered it. They're not quite sure what it does, but they made a stab at what they think the functions of it are. And when I read it, I was like, that's the Sanjiao. That's this, you know, the 3 layers, you know, that govern the regulation of the lymphatic system and the movement of fluid between the different layers, the different compartments of the body. And what kind of made me roll my eyes afterwards was a few weeks later, they announced it again, and then it came out in a couple of more papers. And then some big company put their hands up and said, yeah, and we're now creating a medicine to treat it. And like, hang on a minute, you've only just discovered the organ. Like, how do you know why would you want to treat it? Like, what's wrong with it? You know, we don't know anything about it yet, and yet you want to create something to treat it with. And I think that's just, you know, the ego, this ego thing that we have going on. And it's like, oh, we've discovered it, so now we need to do something with it. You know, there's all these people with inexplicable illnesses, and it must be due to this organ. You know, it's like, just like observe it. And I think that's the difference. People back then observed it. Like, if a buddy of mine in the last podcast, he just launched a book, and it's about the channels. I think it's a great book. And, you know, it's the movement of the sun, literally the movement of the sun around the body dictated how, not necessarily what the channels do and how they interact with the body, but it literally was the guide for how we differentiated the channels. In other words, which channels were more yang and which channels were more yin. And it was just down to how the body is constructed. It's not trying to fit the model to the body. It's allowing the model to come from the body out towards us. And I think that's what's the difference is now, is we're trying to look for stuff. Let's look for something. Let's look for this cure. Let's look for a cure. Let's beat it. Let's fight it. Instead of it, you know, letting the information come to us and observing and saying, oh, that's an interesting interaction. Oh, look how it behaves this way. Instead, we've got to find out how it's constructed, what it looks like. This is the thing, you know, we've got to know what the thing looks like. If we know what it looks like, then we know how it works. You know, structure governs function. And we're like, well, maybe observe its behavior before you start. You know yourself. I'm sure in martial arts, you've come up against people and you thought, yeah, they don't really look that fit, a bit of a belly on them, don't reckon they do much cardio. And then you go to fight them and you're like, oh shit, this guy's got some serious skills, because you've judged them based on some kind of, I'm not saying you have, but you've judged them on some kind of Sports Illustrated magazine where somebody has a six-pack, and you naturally assume that person is fitter than you because they've got a six-pack, you know. And it's very specific, you know. I remember a teacher of mine I'm hoping to have on the podcast. He was saying his master is from one of his masters from Indonesia, and this guy looks like an ordinary little Malaysian guy, not really, doesn't look too fit, not too strong. And he said, if you tackled this guy on the street, it'll be the biggest mistake you'll ever make, because his attitude was the best martial artists in the world are ones that don't look like martial artists. They look like ordinary people, because they're not hanging on to a specific body shape. Like we have an obsession here in Ireland with MMA because of one or two key personalities, inverted commas, albeit sometimes not the best representation of martial skill in personality wise, but there's become an obsession with it. And you see them, they all look the same now, don't they? They all have a similar build, similar stance, similar techniques. And the ones that win are the ones that have a better creativity, better, you know, are able to flow and move and come up with what seemingly is new ways of movement. And they're the ones that are able to overcome and thrive. And it's not something, you know, is for me, there was that kind of initial spark of interest, but now it's a circus now to me. It's a circus, but it's interesting to observe human movement, you know, from that perspective, and how certain people have become conditioned to, now this is what it is to be an MMA fighter, or this is what it is to become a soccer player. And then occasionally we have these people that can do the most incredible, what seems like what my teacher would say is extraordinary human feats. But really, all they've done is they've realized that they've not limited themselves into that, you know, that sort of, I mean, I'm terrible at boxing things off. I like things to be boxed off, you know. That's the water element. That's the earth element. But really, you know, and I know there's a flow, you know, like that. If we look at the earth, the earth contains and holding water, you know. There's always a synergistic response. And more recently, working with herbs, one of the realizations coming to me is that we are fractal. Like there's, you know, if we're to argue that the earth is, say, covered 70% water, let's just argue that fluid, you know, sea, rivers, whatever you want to say, glacial, whatever. And then we go, oh, well, the human body's 70% fluid as well. And you're thinking, well, aren't we pretty much similar to the planet then? You know, shouldn't we treat the planet as good as we would treat our own body and nourish it and allow it to express itself and work with it rather than against it? And I think, current situations aside, I'm wondering, do you have a sense of any kind of global awakening? Is there any kind of realization that something bigger needs to happen, or are we all doomed? Or, you know, I laughing at Richard Branson, like, you know, he had to go up into this. I mean, he wasn't really in space, let's face it. Like, he was skipping along the very top of the atmosphere. Like, he's not really an astronaut as much as he'd like to think he is. And he's looking up at the earth and he's going, oh, and he came down and he said, oh, I realize, you know, I need to do more for the planet and more eco stuff. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, don't fucking go up into the space and burn massive amounts of fuel and you know, and show off, you know. Spend your money on saving the planet, not trying to skip along the atmosphere. We live in madness. I'm sure you agree. Like, human beings are mad. We're still in the pram. We're still kids in the pram or in the cot throwing toys out. We haven't. Are we evolving at all? Are we still? Where are we, Egwin? You tell me.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very interesting question, to be honest. In general, I'd say, like, there is no such thing as linearity, if that is a word, in development at all. I do understand that everyone right now is talking about this 5D and this new 5D, not G. So the this awakening into the fifth dimension and stuff like that. And I mean, yes, cosmologically speaking, yes, there is a shift in energies definitely going on. Some of the base frequencies of the planet, they are in a process of change. Still, at the moment, globally speaking, we are in the process of trying to shake something loose. Well, not so much even trying, but things are being shaken loose right now that, in terms of their origin, go many thousands of years back. So if we zoom out, I do think that we are in the end portions of a very large circle, or yeah, cycle, that's the word. But when I say that, then I mean that I'd say we are still a couple of 100 years away from that end point.
I get you.
I don't think that the real massive shifts can happen within this lifetime, for the simple reason being that at the moment there is still too much in the dark for the major portions of the population. There still needs to be a lot of quote unquote awakening. What I mean by that is understanding themselves, understanding their role in nature, not even in a full-on spiritual sense, but just in the sense of how important it is to connect and to reconnect, how things are interlinked with each other. And I mean, right now we are in that in that interesting slash dangerous phase of where it gets more and more towards AI and towards transhumanism,
Yeah.
which I think for living free, for being free, for living healthy and living in a connected way is probably the most dangerous development out there at the moment.
I think that's the biggest truth I've heard all year.
Because you know, when you need a fucking ring on your finger that's connected to your phone that then tells you whether or not your sleep was one of a recovery or one that stressed you out even more. And I think there is just something so fundamentally wrong, because it pushes humans more and more away from their natural abilities. And we're not even talking about abilities that you have to hone in the monastery and become a monk, like I said earlier. No, we're talking about the most fundamental recognition of, oh, that felt good.
Yeah.
Like literally this. I'm not talking about massive extrasensory perception, as it's called nowadays, which is also totally normal, by the way. But like all of those things, I'm really talking about this simplicity of being, the simplicity of realizing how nurturing, how supportive it is to just give yourself a couple of breaths when you sit out in the sun, in the grass, digging your hands into the ground and just feeling the sensation of the grass for no other purpose than just doing that. And then being able to describe that sensation, because that's really what those artificial developments right now, they push people away more and more, even from those very basic perceptional and yeah, understanding aspects. Yeah, being able to understand what your body tells you without having to verify it via numbers on an app or through a second person, aka maybe a doctor or a DNA specialist who tells you, yeah, well, you're fucked because your DNA looks like you probably have 10 different ailments in 5 years. Well, there is a lot of things that we can do to change that. And there is a lot of research to back it up that we can. It's just something that seems not to be in the interest nowadays for whatever reasons. I mean, going down that rabbit hole and discussing reasons is a whole different story in itself.
Yeah.
But I think at the moment, in terms of your question regarding this where are we in terms of development globally, I think at that point right now, at this point right now, it's really about developing and conserving the most fundamental things that make us living beings and humans. It's not even about jumping ahead and making sure that every single person meditates for the sake of the planet or things like that. Yeah. Those are results of a much more important step, which is not to lose sight of oneself, not to lose sight of simple things and simple ability to describe one's own status, recognize that this is where I am right now, this is where I want to go, and being able to differentiate between different informations that come in from different directions, whether that's the media or a paper that you read or your own experience, even like being able to still pull back and look at things from a different perspective, from a meta perspective, if you will. and just retaining this capacity. I think that is the most important thing that has to be done right now, because from that, naturally, things like taking care of your environment, taking more care of your body, taking care of your relationships, or being more conscious in relationships, those are all results of being able to differentiate, of being able to describe what is it that I feel, of being able to understand my actions have consequences. And I'm not even talking about big ones, like, okay, I don't know, I'm gonna put a bucket of water in front of the bed of my friend, and when he wakes up, he's gonna step in it. Ha ha ha. Like, I'm not even talking about such things, or like really massive things, like, okay, when you drive drunk, then potentially you make an accident and stuff like that. I'm not even talking about this. I'm talking about the little things, the small things where you realize, hang on, okay, why am I so stressed out right now? Why does, quote unquote, the energy of the day put so much pressure on me, maybe? Like, is this because someone wants something bad from me? Is this some external influence, or what is it? And sometimes it might be, but it might just as well be something as simple as your body being so massively, quote unquote, again, to use that term, undernourished, or so far into a stress response that you weren't even aware of, that your vessel, psychologically as well as physically and energetically, at this point isn't even able to handle whatever impact, quote unquote, comes from maybe even positive situations when you look at them objectively, and they start to stress people out, or energies, and objectively they would actually be something nurturing, but we're not even able to take them because we're so far gone already.
Yeah.
Conserving those abilities, conserving this very, very foundation, I think this is really the key that will carry us into the next decades and centuries, with growing importance, actually. And supporting people in that, on that journey, supporting people also when they sort of feel alienated in society, because they still retain that capacity, but they hardly find anyone who also has this still, supporting such people through acknowledgement and through understanding. I think those are some of the most simplest things that we can do to contribute in a positive sense down the line for the next 200 to 600 years, something like that, I'd say.
Yeah.
And the more and more we interact on such a level, the beauty about this is that it's extremely organic and natural. A tree grows totally on its own, changes its leaves a little bit with where the sun comes from, and then the vines underneath the tree, or the grass underneath the tree, they organize themselves in this sort of field of possibilities to coexist. And I think supporting the possibilities for coexistence through recognizing in others that are still using their own innate abilities, the most fundamental ones of what it means to be human, like feeling, like perceiving, like nourishing, like taking care of others. Those things, they support the environment, quote unquote, in which something organically something can grow organically. And in this case, this thing that should grow organically, or potentially can grow organically, would be our own evolution.
Yeah.
And survival actually, because I think that's where it comes down to. Right now, it's really a matter of, will those parts of humanity survive long enough before complete destruction?
Yeah, I had a
And
massive
even more so, last thing, even more so, will they, because they will never completely cease to exist, but will they be readily available in a big enough amount of strength and present in 200-300 years when the outside circumstances change? Or will it, after that, literally take a couple of 1,000 years of recovery back to what it means to be us?
Yeah. We're coming up now to the end of the podcast, so I kind of want to close with any sort of information, like some brief tips, hints, nothing too complicated for the viewers or listeners, for a daily, I mean, obviously not standing up demonstrating it. We can point to the work that you're doing in terms of movement, consciousness, breath, removing, allowing, I suppose, allowing new possibilities, new ideas around the body. On the note that you just said, I remember having a dream when I was 25 in which the people that want to leave Earth leave. They basically fuck off. And the rest of us, the ones that want to stay, stay. And we construct a society that lives above the planet. So a little bit like Super Mario, we live in the clouds, and what happens is we allow then the Earth to breathe. So it's a little bit like the Avatar scenario where there's either anti-gravitational, whatever you want to call it, technology is used so that we can live within the atmosphere but not on the Earth, and allow the Earth to kind of regenerate. It was the most fantastic dream. I'm not saying it's going to come true. Maybe it's a reality of a different Earth in a different universe, but I remember thinking to myself, it is possible. It's totally possible. Probably not in our current human lifetime, but it is totally possible. It may require those that want to leave to go first, and let them go, let them leave. If they want to go to Mars or wherever else, off you go. Some of us are custodians of this planet. Others want to go and explore. It is what it is. But on a final note, before we finish, I'm aware now that I've got to wrap this up. So can you give us 2 or 3 Egwinisms for the day, daily Egwin practices that help you nourish yourself?
Yeah, I mean, to put it in the simplest possible terms, nourish exactly what I mentioned earlier. Nourish your ability to perceive, nourish your ability to consciously and deliberately connect with yourself and use that ability. Now, how could that look like? This could be something as simple as waking up in the morning and before jumping out of bed, just making yourself aware of your breath, making yourself aware of the body that you are in, and with as little judgment as possible. And I recently just pre-launched a new course. It's just a 3-hour virtual workshop, basically, where I talk about movement hygiene, and that wraps around some of those very fundamental movement possibilities that we can do, but that have potentially a massive impact on our mobility, on our health, on our ability to reconnect with ourselves. And that, again, obviously transmits out into the world we live in our relationships, in our interaction with the world, and so on and so on. So whatever you do, really make sure that throughout the day you have a couple of minutes where you really pay close attention to what's authentically you. For many of us, this will start with the physical form, but it doesn't have to necessarily. It can, and it is absolutely 100% valid. And the funny thing is, in its most minimalistic way to do this, It does not matter when you do it. It does not matter if you are in nature when you do it. It is only about the recognition of the abilities, the recognition of being able to move the body, the recognition of even having a body. Those are the most fundamental and simplest things that one can do. And if it's just a minute or 2 or 3 minutes a day where you sort of remind yourself of that, breaking out of the constantly more and more technicized world and reconnect with something that is inherently natural. And remember, Anthony, in the first WellCare Summit, I presented that concept of the quote unquote concrete diet. Concrete meaning cement in this specific case, where I talked about the influence of shapes, of architectural spaces on our perception and on our health. And that would then probably be the second cue that I give to the viewers. Just try to interact with nature. It doesn't matter how big that part of nature is. And if it is a pot plant in your home, it's better than nothing. But be conscious, observe it, observe the leaves, be interested, not in a scientific sense, but interested in a curious sense of how it changes shape minutely every single day, because it grows, the leaves move and stuff like that without any additional help. Just being conscious about the natural processes that are going on in and around you. And that will automatically open you up more and more and more to this deep ability to then grow even stronger roots in yourself again.
Cool.
And through that, it doesn't require very sophisticated techniques. That may be really on the last note. Like I said, I did a lot of different things, but I can tell you the most powerful techniques I've ever seen and learned are by far the simplest ones I've ever seen. Like a couple of years ago, I recovered an old grounding and recharging exercise that was used in the ancient world, that within 5 minutes, every single time I do it, provides more grounding, more stability, more energy, if you will, and more clarity than any single Qigong exercise I've done in the past 30 years. And this is not only that one specific method again. It is just the simplest things. They take you the furthest because they trigger subconsciously your consciousness, your awareness. And that is what you need to develop and to train. And you train it by those simple things of recognition and of awareness through movement, just being aware of your elbow moving or something like that. That's how you train your mind to even perceive possibilities that lie in the space that is not strictly controlled by technology or by rules or anything like that, but that is driven by nature itself.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, man. That's totally
really
beautiful.
My message for you. It's
great.
It's not about the sophisticated techniques. It's about the simple, small things you can do for your consciousness, and then your consciousness feeds back to you more and richer possibilities from which again you can grow. And that is the cycle of life that can help you to progress forward in the most minimalistic yet very, very powerful sense possible.
Egwin, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a lesson. It's been a masterclass in consciousness and understanding where we're sitting right now as humans. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to leave links below to Egwin's work if you want to hop on to any one of his classes that he's running online. please support him. It's important for our health, for our wellness, for our evolution. Thanks, Egwin, today. It's been wonderful. And we'll see you all soon again.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks. It was really a pleasure. It was really a pleasure being here. And I absolutely love this. Sharing information like this naturally, organically, without the script, because that's exactly what.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again
Cheers.
for the possibility, Anthony. And yeah, have a great time. Talk soon.
Thanks.